I'm going to be trying to today just demystify data protection and cybersecurity and make a case for you on why, from a public policy perspective, including on health, on public health and public policy, we need to ensure that they are critical pillars for digital health steps in this country. In fact, the presupposition there is that they are right now not strong enough pillars of what we're doing on digital health. Briefly, a bit about myself. Access Now, we're an international not-for-profit organization, and I want to speak to you a bit about what we do. But I also want to give you a little bit of what I am, and I always joke, right? I walk into a room and say, I'm a lawyer. Please don't hold that against me. I'm trained as a lawyer. I went to law school, and I worked in the space of technology policy, particularly over the last over a decade, particularly focusing on how government regulators, elected lawmakers, courts, and other institutions are engaged on the conversation that shape technology. Because the first myth, perhaps I want to unpack here, is that technology has always existed due to and shaped by governmental intervention, policy conversation, regulation. The internet was, for example, arguably a US government-funded creation, and at every step of the way, you've had governments involved in this process. I've also worked in the private sector. I worked in Google for 5 years, including on how data can be used in public health, including on things such as flu trends and other issues. So I have a perspective of how data can be used, but also the sort of lobbying arguments that you see industry using all the time. And that's what I do these days. My penance is I work for an excellent international not-for-profit organization. Access Now is an advocacy organization that seeks to protect and extend digital rights globally. It focuses particularly on areas around privacy, data protection, freedom of expression, business and human rights. The idea being that technology empowers and liberates, but it also puts people at harm. It puts people at risk, and that requires interventions that require companies, technologies to change what they do. It requires governments to sometimes change laws that they're passing, or to intervene and to regulate, and for regulators to take stronger action focusing on individuals and on, you could say, the lay public, and not just the concerns of special interest groups. We work, as I mentioned in this context, in trying to shape what intergovernmental processes, what corporate sector actors, and what national parliaments, regulators, and others do, including in the Asia-Pacific region. And I want to talk a little bit about what this is and what this isn't about today. Fundamentally, I want to demystify a bit of how data protection and cybersecurity are, and as I mentioned, how they must focus as critical pillars for digital health conversations. And specifically, we need to recognize a couple of things. This is not a talk about AI and ethics, and there's an important reason why I'm emphasizing this, which we'll come to later. Secondly, data protection and cybersecurity, or if you call it digital security or you call it InfoSec, choose whichever term you want, they're broadly the same thing, although I know some people will criticize me for saying that. And they're related to each other, but they are not the same thing in itself, and that data protection and cybersecurity are not the same thing. Their Venn diagrams intersect, but they're not the same overlapping circle. I want to explain why I made this comment a little bit about ethics now. The conversation on artificial intelligence and machine learning requires perhaps less of a focus on ethics and more tangibly on governmental oversight, regulation, and generally governance. And why I mentioned that is ethics can mean many, many things. And I actually was particularly keen to come here to CMC Vellore to talk to you all on this because, for example, the way ethics is understood in this field of medicine and its relationship with law is perhaps not the same way in how it's being understood in AI. And what's happening instead in AI is that you are seeing a lot of focus on ethics guidelines being the solution to everything. Ethics guidelines will solve all the problems, all the societal and technologist and potentially legal issues that AI or machine learning applications may trigger. This is from a website from a colleague of mine, an excellent academic called Daniel Alufa, who works with us in Access Now. He wrote this and he quoted this when he was a Mozilla fellow. And one of the myths there on this website around AI and myths is this, that AI ethics will save us. Specifically, and that's why you need to separate AI ethics and practice versus ethics as a governance mechanism. And the reason that's the case is that you've seen an explosion when it comes to AI ethics documents over the last few years, and with a significant number related to industry. And I know that some members of the audience are interested about the role of industry and the role of governance and accountability. But for example, in 2019, a study by Anna Jubin noted that the global landscape on AI ethics had seen 84 documents published on ethical guidelines and principles for AI, with 88% of them being published since 2016. There's an explosion of guidelines. And when this was last updated, and this data was, I think, from around 2021, the inventory on AI ethics guidelines that is maintained by Algorithm Watch, you can see the website online, lists over 160 AI ethics guidelines and constantly being updated. So there's an explosion of ethics documents that are out there. And one reason, obviously, is if anyone of you has ever worked in public policy or government or governance or even the space of public advocacy, is that self-regulatory guidelines and codes are often put out by industry and other actors as a way to stave off regulation. It's saying, look, we're doing a great job in-house. Why does national regulator, the government department, or the national parliament need to regulate on this issue? Sometimes that might be good. We might come to good solutions without requiring more inflexible mechanisms like a law passed by parliament or rules controlled by a government department in Delhi. But sometimes it is just what it is, which is it is a lobbying tool to stave off potentially important regulation or potentially important public conversation on regulation. Remember, we are a democracy, which means when we debate and discuss, that public conversation is important, even if a regulation doesn't result out of it. Therefore, what I want you to focus on instead a bit is what is data protection. It is a critical key element of the digital health conversation, and understand what that is. Data protection fundamentally is around the idea of protecting your data, particularly looking at how any information that is related to you, namely personal data, how it relates to your private, professional, or public life, how it should be protected. Specifically, it refers to the safeguards, practices, and the binding rules that exist in this space. Law is one part of it. There are many other elements on top of law that data protection serves. But the idea is that there is personal information. It is yours. You get to decide how you remain in control of it. That doesn't mean that you are always in control of it, but you have the legal rights to determine how it is accessed and controlled. Specifically, you should be able to decide when and how you want to share it, to what amount, who has access to it, for how long, and who can modify this, and for what reason is it being shared. It's very important to note that it is a wide set of categories, but even there, government does often have a legitimate role to also look into the issue of data breach. It has a security consideration here. And by security here, I don't mean just national security. I mean general security on societal systems and practices around mitigating harms if your data is part of a wider data breach that causes in people to find out personal information, not just about you, but about many, many individuals together or key communities. Therefore, data protection has certain key elements. It looks at that you need to have a definition of personal information, which can be personal information and sensitive personal information. You want to ensure that you give data protection rights to individuals, and you want to ensure that you have an effective regulator. Because when you give rights, you need to give a remedy. You need to give accountability and oversight as well. And in an AI and data protection and digital health conversation context, it's very important to look at certain specific rights, namely the data protection rights to explainability, data access, and data deletion. And what that means is if I was today in a country where the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, the EU's continent-wide framework on data protection for EU member states, if I was there, I have a right to seek a copy of my data if you collected it. I have a right to seek the deletion of that data if I believe its use is no longer valid by that entity, if it is a private entity or even in many cases a public entity in those countries. And I also often have a right, which is the more interesting, controversial one sometimes, to demand that I be explained how it's being used. And for example, if machine learning systems or algorithmic systems are coming to inferences or decisions based on my data, I have a right to be provided explainability. How is that decision being made on the basis of my data? It is, of course, useful to step aside from Europe or other countries for a second to talk about where we are right now in India when it comes to privacy and data protection. Unfortunately, no conversation on this doesn't, bring up the fact that in 2017, the Indian Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling on privacy. It is perhaps the one and only time I will mention a court ruling during my presentation. No worries, I'm not going to bore you with details. But what's important there is that the Indian Supreme Court was required to clarify, not to create a fundamental right to privacy. It was the Indian government's lawyers who went to the Supreme Court and said Indians do not have a fundamental right to privacy. And some of you who might have occasionally studied public health and law know that actually for many years the issue of privacy has come up in a health context. There are cases on the topic. There's been a recognition that parts of the Indian Constitution and law apply to provide a right to privacy, including in a health context. But government lawyers went and argued, they made a strong provocative argument that there is no fundamental right to privacy, it's a more limited right. And the Indian Supreme Court said, sorry, we disagree. 9 judges of the Supreme Court categorically said that they disagree on this. But what's more important there is that they recognize that privacy has many different elements. And one part of that is informational privacy, protecting information, particularly in a digital context. And it noted there that that may require a more specific regulatory framework, namely that of data protection. Why I'm saying this to you is for you to understand that every resident of India, the Republic of India, has a categorical fundamental right to privacy. But the Supreme Court clarified saying that there is an obligation to create a further positive framework to protect your rights when it comes to informational privacy in a data context, namely a data protection law. A federal data protection law, because we do want one that applies to the entire country. Again, noting in many other countries similar to us, you have data protection laws at the federal, that means for the entire national context, and you also have laws at the state level, which you may encounter if you ever deal with doctors or health practitioners from many parts of the European Union, particularly Germany, Canada, Australia, and other federal countries that have data protection laws. These efforts started in 2009, actually, before this Supreme Court judgment, the effort to create a federal data protection law, and we're still waiting. It's been 2 administrations, and then soon it'll be 1 year till we have the next set of general elections. And my suspicion is, if you ask me to come present to you a year from now, I'm going to be saying we're still waiting, or that there is a bad law that needs fixing. Because in fact, every version of the data protection law in India that's been brought forward has actually been worse than the one before. It's quite a depressing and striking conversation if you ever talk to data protection or privacy analysts in this country. But what's interesting is that independent of this, if you look at any country in the world that engages on this topic, they note that health requires special consideration. Even countries which have a complicated political context around data protection at the federal level, for example, the US, which does not actually have a federal, horizontally applicable law on data protection, has one around health information. You heard the previous speaker make reference to that, mentioning HIPAA, the Health Information Portability and Protection Act in the United States, which in fact from early on has regulated the tech sector in how it can collect health data and make it accessible. I noted earlier that data protection and cybersecurity are related. They're not the same thing, but they also don't stand in conflict to each other, as I mentioned. It is, for example, in the interests of data protection authorities that systems are secured so data breaches don't occur. And similarly, folks concerned about cybersecurity are glad if less data is collected in a more responsible way, because that makes it less likely for data breaches and cyber incidents to take place. And fundamentally, let's step back to recognize what is cybersecurity. It is around securing our ICT networks, products, software, and hardware. Nothing is hack-proof. Nothing is perfectly secure. Even today, many of you would be using Android phones, including Samsung phones, maybe a Google Pixel. I just saw an alert from Google itself this morning that said, sorry, we have realized that there is a deep security issue with all Android phones that are available right now from a particular manufacturer, including ourselves. And that means, for example, calls over Wi-Fi networks are actually not secure. We ask you to temporarily stop using them and wait for a patch that we will deploy as soon as possible later today. In fact, cybersecurity is literally an arms race. Every day, people are trying to figure out and understand what's going on. And for those of you who work in virology or other areas, it's that same thing. Constant mutation, constant things to deal with. But in this case, you're dealing with human minds for profit or for just mischief reasons, who are constantly trying to exploit, sometimes for mostly negative reasons, vulnerabilities that exist in all software and hardware systems. In a cybersecurity and health context, I wanted to note that we do need to look at what is a good policy approach to cybersecurity. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is what my organization believes is good cybersecurity policy from governments or governance actors. Namely, that it is something that is systemic. It's not a quick response to something. It's something that applies regularly. It's not a response to every crisis. It's not a quick fire, rapid draw solution. Secondly, that it is user-centric. The idea of cybersecurity should not be to only protect, say, government or big industry. It is to protect every individual. Because by the way, if individuals are vulnerable, the entire ICT system and networks you depend on will continue to be vulnerable. And lastly, and which is something I think which is important to recognize again in a democracy like ours, but of course from an advocacy organization that works on human rights, We believe that all cybersecurity policy must be anchored in open democratic processes. In fact, you get good cybersecurity policy when it's open and publicly discussed. And that leads me to a little bit of what is our Indian failure that I want you to take away here, which is that we don't learn from what's happened before. And I know that this has come up yesterday and perhaps also referred to in some of the conversations earlier today from other speakers, but I think Aadhaar is a good example. One approach we often see when it comes to technology and governance in India is to say, let's create systems, and then you will see actors involved in the space saying literally, no, there are no issues there. They are forced to confront what the problems are. Sometimes, as you know, government sometimes even prosecutes or warns people when they disclose vulnerabilities in their systems. But then they do recognize it happens and they say, well, the system already exists. It's too big to fail or to reset. So let us fix it where it is. And which is always a dangerous thing, right? And I'll leave you with this little image. You don't want to be fixing the plane while you're flying it or building it while you're flying it. Small fixes may be okay, but if you're doing that on a regular basis, you would not, in the space of at least civil aviation, be allowed to continue as a pilot or as an airline or as an airplane manufacturer. Perhaps we need the same approach when it comes to digital health and large tech and governance projects in India as well. Another example of sometimes the other extreme of bad policymaking in India is of rushed, perhaps over excessive regulation issued to try to address many interests. And here, this is a very technical example, so bear with me for 30 seconds because you may not know the background. In 2022, the Indian Computer Emergency Response Team, which is an agency of India's Department of Electronics and IT in Delhi, issued a set of binding regulations under India's Information Technology Act. It used the statutory power that Parliament had given the government back in 2009 to issue these new binding cybersecurity reporting guidelines that basically put in place significantly onerous requirements to anyone who runs an ICT system in India to report a cyber incident. And say, reporting cyber incidents are a good thing. In fact, many data protection laws require you to disclose a data breach. But this was so problematic because it's simple language that was left in there. They said that you must maintain log information for everything for a certain period, which is extremely, for example, problematic. For example, in CMC Vellore, the log information of internet access reveals very granular information of what people might be doing. Other log information, for example, of different providers can be extremely sometimes problematic to keep. It in fact creates a cybersecurity risk by itself because the information is not just who logs into a network, but contains other information. An attacker can target and use that. Those regulations were drafted at short notice with practically, not short notice, it was drafted with no notice and put out publicly with no consultation with cybersecurity experts or even chief information security officers. People who talk regularly to the government, including say to the Reserve Bank of India, to the stock markets and the stock market regulator and others were surprised and shocked. They said, the government just came out with this. We don't want to criticize them publicly, but I can't understand what these regulations are. I can't implement them. And people I work with who try to provide cybersecurity in India are saying, we have to exit your market because this is too dangerous, this is too tricky. We'd rather create some legal protection and cover for ourselves. And that's a takeaway we need to have, that we don't sometimes need to go for over-excessive regulation that tries to cover many interests. The cybersecurity regulations try to serve a police interest. Parts of the Indian government are very keen to have access to all information that VPNs and others do. Parts of the Indian government have valid reasons to just want to know the number of cyber attacks that are happening in India because we are one of the worst targeted countries in the world, but very little data out there. But it was mashed together in a bad over-excessive regulation. And that's what we need to recognize in a wider space right now. We actually have a crisis going on. And let me name it. I'm not trying to be dramatic, but we must recognize when a crisis exists in order to fix it. And namely, in the space of digital health, data protection, and privacy law, we have one. And two great examples here, and they've all come up before, so I don't need to expand on them too much. You talked, and one of the previous speakers also spoke about this. The National Digital Health Mission has been set about, and it is now issuing health IDs. There's a typo on that slide. I apologize for that. But what's important to recognize from the issuance of those health IDs is that it's happening under actually no legal framework at all. And it's not like the government doesn't know this. Then they initiated public consultations on this process during the pandemic. They were told multiple times, what is the legal structure and legal authorization for the National Digital Health Mission? Because as you know, health in India is a state subject. The states actually get to determine and provide services on health with support of the center on many issues. And hospitals also are often regulated by state-level regulations or interventions. And people specifically said, given that health data is so sensitive, how will you regulate or protect this? The government said, we'll try to create a mechanism. It is 2023 that doesn't exist, but you see health IDs being issued. Previous speaker noted that the government issued a press release saying that health IDs are not mandatory. Well, if you were in Chandigarh in 2021, 2020, you did not know that because the government, including the public hospitals there, was saying it is mandatory. And as you know, if you're a doctor working for a government health department and your supervisor says this is mandatory, it is mandatory, because even if later, for example, that turns out that you were right, you will still be written up for insubordination and you will be fired. If you're a patient coming in at last minute for triage, you're not going to go and find a lawyer to make this case to you, right? You're not going to find someone who can go to the High Court of Punjab and Haryana or go to the Supreme Court. You will give your information over. You'll create a health ID, although you don't know who has issued it, you don't know how it can be perhaps updated, you don't know how it can be deleted if you want it deleted. The other good example is the AIMS cyber attack. If you followed a little bit of the extremely disturbing cyber attack that took place on AIMS, what is even more telling is if you read the newspapers, there was a new government agency mentioned every day involved in the response and mitigation. And why I mention that is this is not making fun of the government. The government itself said it was a disaster. Everybody started getting involved. Nobody knew who was the primary responder in incident. And anyone who does triage or deals in an emergency room knows, right? You need very clear protocols. When someone is rushed in, who responds in what manner? Because in fact, if somebody in a rapid emergency triage situation does something wrong, immediately there are going to be consequences. You want to know who's in charge. This is a way it was described in the United Kingdom in 2018-19 when they created their national cybersecurity strategy. The then Prime Minister asked a room saying, if a cyber incident takes place, the buck stops with me, but who else will be in the room with me? And his civil servants didn't have an answer. And they created a framework to outline that, saying that here are the people in charge. In India, we recognize this is a problem, by the way. In 2020, if I remember correctly, sorry, it might have been 2021, in the Independence Day speech, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said, India needs an updated national cybersecurity strategy that outlines clearly who is in charge of what. Unfortunately, we are in 2023 and that's still not out there. And perhaps while we can't, perhaps the government has many issues to fix on that wider strategy. In health, we need an answer. We need to know who is in charge on cybersecurity matters. Again, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in France, in many major other democracies, or even some of our neighbors in the wider Asian region, there's a clear answer on cybersecurity, who is in charge on health data issues, on health cyber incidents, and who you can go for help. Lastly, I do want to mention this a little bit to you. We need to learn from what we saw in the pandemic. And in fact, in the pandemic, you saw a real struggle and effort made by many people in the privacy and data protection community with public health people to say, we need rapid, quick responses to what's going on, but we can't abandon human rights. We can't abandon privacy and ideas of data protection. And we try to create some guidance here. And this is an excerpt of some of our guidance, particularly around public health responses, noting that the public health response, and this again builds on what the World Health Organization itself said, doesn't mean that you abandon human rights. It means you use human rights law as how it applies to public health situations to give you guidance. And in fact, you shouldn't be asking people to sacrifice privacy for health. That is a fundamental requirement of acceptable human society. That also means that when it comes to issues around national identity and digital identity, and I believe Kiran spoke about this yesterday, we need to also keep asking that question. Yes, identity information can be helpful, but why are we asking for what purpose? And this is a public letter, a public advocacy letter that had been issued in 2017, and now is part of a global network called YID that asks that question. When you want to create a national identity or digital identity system, ask the questions why, for whom, for what reason, under what framework. I just want to jump a little bit to the forward-looking agenda and end here. I think there are three elements that we need to focus on very clearly. If you want to fix or stave away the upcoming crisis when it comes to digital health and data in this country and how it relates to privacy, we need three quick, immediate solutions. We do need a comprehensive, horizontally applicable world-class data protection law and regulator. The Indian government has, for example, said that they are redrafting the data protection law, and they provided a copy of that bill before the session of parliament took place. They said they'll bring it into this session of parliament. Everyone who looked at it said this is actually not a world-class privacy law. It will actually create India as an outlier, not doing, in fact, even Sri Lanka, which recently passed a law last year, would have a stronger law than ours. So that law needs to be passed, but with improvements. And it needs to be in consultation publicly with folks like you, not just with industry or folks within government in Delhi. Secondly, you need a clear legal framework for the National Digital Health Mission. You need to ensure, in the meantime, that perhaps there's a temporary, clear emergency fix when it comes to the issue of digital health data and privacy. And what I mean by that today is right now, there's literally not even a clear government order on how the NDHM collects data. And if you, a doctor, a person in the system, or a patient is concerned, how you can approach and who you can approach and what remedy you can obtain there. That is something that needs to be written out right now. Not a government press release, but a government order, at least partly enforceable if someone went to court. And lastly, which is perhaps a more meta comment I wanted to make here, you see so many conversations around AI taking place in a health context, particularly from the government of India. And when the government anchors a conversation, whether it's for itself or talking to you all or talking to the private sector, there perhaps we need a more clearer human rights framing, not just ethics. And that's where I suggest we need a clear working group with people from the public health, human rights, legal, but also wider set of constituencies with the government of India. So if it's Niti Aayog or if it's other ministries, there is a clearer focus from a rights-based approach when it comes to AI, data, and conversations in India. And with that, I will end, and I look forward to questions now. And of course, if we don't get to speak here in person, please feel free to drop me an email anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Ramanjit. That was a very, informative talk that you gave us. So we will open for questions. I think just one question maybe, because we're running 20 minutes late already.
Thanks a lot for the enlightening talk, because I don't think we have heard this before, at least sitting here. So I have one question. So now in India, everything is digital. You can't survive without doing anything digitally. And every time we get an upgrade or we need to install something, we have to say, yes, I agree. And I think we all do that, even though I don't know how many of us actually go through the entire agreement, even though we say, mail it to me. Okay, so coming to this point, so this is all very good, but everybody in India, at least whoever I see, has a cell phone. But I don't know how aware are they about privacy, health information privacy. So I know there are advertisements on television about, okay, how do you keep your account secure? And Amitabh Bachchan comes and says a lot of things. But I'm saying, where is health in all this? I have not seen a single ad which says, these are your rights. This is what you have a right to privacy of your own information. Because wherever you walk in, you are given a form and you fill in everything.
Yes.
So how do you know what are my rights? How does the public know? Of course I know, but how does the public know? How does the common man know this?
No, that's an excellent question. And let me start with the point you mentioned about the Amitabh Bachchan and other ads about cybersecurity. Why are those ads happening also? Those ads are happening because the private sector believes it needs to show that it's doing more. The technology sector, big tech or Indian tech companies as well, are trying to say, we want to do more. They're doing that perhaps some of them out of the goodness of their heart, but most of them are doing it because they fear if we don't show to the government we're doing this, they will think poorly of us. And in many countries, if the regulator exists, they will force us under tighter regulation, or the government will pass tighter regulations. Why I mean there is that they're doing this because they are concerned about the government and regulatory conversation. And often, for example, many of these security campaign ads, some of them again legitimate to prevent attacks, some of them just to show that they're good public citizens, but they're happening because these companies are subject to data protection regulation and oversight in other countries. Indians are perhaps the biggest benefits of the outsourcing, offshoring of the, you could say, a regulatory surplus from the European Union and elsewhere. Because companies have to deal with the GDPR there, they are forced to sometimes apply those practices, or at least that approach here. But this is where, if we had that conversation, if we had a law that said you need to provide clarity to people on what their rights are, maybe a company will come and say, yes, that's true. Perhaps the easiest way is to do an advertising campaign in public health. Right now, they're under no obligation at all. There's no regulatory fear at all as well. So they will do nothing in this space. And of course, as you know, if you make it a requirement for government and public institutions, whatever it might be, they will do it. It might be as simple as a poorly printed out A4 sheet outside a health station saying, here is your concerns, here is the department director you can contact, in English, not even in the local language, although hopefully in the local language. 2 more complicated, simple posters, 2 public campaigns. Now, all that happens when you make a public commitment, either a legal requirement, or, as you know, laws are sometimes useful not just because they're laws, but because they send a signal. It's called the signaling effect, saying this is a public priority for our country, for our democracy. And the RTI Act there is a great example, right? The RTI Act put out a clear signal saying government departments must respect and make sure that people have access to information. They created rights saying that you must be able to access your data in this way, and government departments must proactively publish this. But they also clearly said that there will be consequences if you don't do that. So perhaps that's what we again require. If we had a data protection law that said actors need to publicly disclose how they collect data, particularly if it's sensitive data relating to health, you would see those actions there. Because we are not having that conversation today. And in fact, we are allowing for public health projects or digital health projects to kick out without any form of scrutiny or even pressure. You see this massive collection of data. In fact, what's happening is a grandfathering in of data. People are collecting data and then saying, look, we got some consent form from them, even though they didn't understand what it is. Or maybe we send them a message and they said, I don't choose to opt out. They're saying that's there. So we need that intervention. But that intervention will only happen if you raise a ruckus or if you see consensus and a signal coming from our governing institutions, which unfortunately today has not happened strongly enough.
Thank you.
Thank you for underlining that famous quote by Helen Keller that security is a myth. And I just want to ask one thing. Recently, the Indian government put regulations on VPNs. Did that help the cybersecurity better? Did that give a better thing? I just want to ask.
Admittedly biased answer, I have a strong view on that topic. And the short answer, this is the 2022 cybersecurity regulations I was mentioning in my presentation. No, I don't think it's made cybersecurity better. Actually, it's created a cult, an environment of fear. People who, in fact, would have spoken to the computer emergency response team of the government of India don't do so because they're afraid the CERT will ask them in that same meeting, how are you collecting this data, what's going on there. It's made many people who are keen to deploy cybersecurity services and more cybersecurity assistance in India wary of being here because they fear that somebody is going to enforce that on them. And also, in a sense, it sucked up energy from the room to what could have been a productive conversation. And I'll give you again one useful illustration on this. A former senior official who was the US government cybersecurity coordinator told me this, and he's a former cop attorney, but he said it's very important if you're doing cybersecurity in government where you're trying to provide assistance or get people to improve their cybersecurity, you go in there not as a cop, but you say, you can trust me, you can talk to me, I'll help you. It's what incident response people say, we are first incident responders if a cybersecurity attack happens. We are like the fire brigade or like an ambulance. We are not the police. We are not coming in there to make someone suffer a legal consequence. We're there to fix the problem, provide you emergency assistance, and then others will come in. And unfortunately, those VPN guidelines have made cybersecurity conversations with the government of India more a policing question and less a emergency assistance solution.
Okay, I think that's, thank you, Ramanjit, for that.